I'm Alex Schaffner, the store's events director, and I have been looking forward to this for months. Before we get going, just a few notes. Thank you in advance for your patience with notes. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. As you know, you're supporting an incredible writer. Ooh, I'm louder now. You're supporting an incredible writer. Can you turn that down a bit, guys? This is mic 1. You're also supporting.
This is mic 2.
Ooh.
I'm just being tricky. Sounds like this, actually. I'm sorry. I should have started being mischievous already, should I?
This is like the most sincere part of my intro, but, well, no, that's not true. It gets more sincere. Get ready. But thank you for supporting an independent bookstore. I know some of you are from the neighborhood, some of you are from very far away, and all of you are part of our community because you're here, you are smiling. If you weren't smiling, you would still count. And you have bought books from us, so you are part of our community, and I want to thank you for that. Second, there's a lot of us, as you may have noticed. Please try to keep ahead of the stanchion or that guardrail behind you, because people may need to go through that channel to check out with their normal purchases in their normal day, and also try to leave that door open because it's much safer if we can exit. Third, when we form the signing line after the Q&A, we're going to form it along this wall and then back through the gift room and then into the store. And somebody will help you, but that's the basic direction we want to go in, and yes, we will post it. And yes, if you have other books with you, they can be signed. If you have more than 5 books with you, please go to the end of the line so that we can move things along quickly. If you can't stand for a long period of time, please see us right away so we can move you to the front. Finally, I know that it can be a bit loud in a bookstore at 6 p.m. on a Saturday, so thank you for bearing with us, and if you need us to talk up or hold the mic really, really close, just let us know and we can accommodate. Those are the notes. We also have an introduction to Garth Nix. I'm going to give an intro and then I'm going to ask questions, and then there's going to be a reading, and then you're going to ask questions, and it's all going to be very good. But to start, when I first encountered Garth's work, it was through my children's librarian mother, who along with all of her cohort were obsessed with Sabriel. They waited in agony from one book to the next. I, luckily, didn't read them until Sabriel, Ariel, and Abhorsen were all published, and better yet, until they all had audiobooks narrated by Tim Curry. These books literally saved my academic career. It was 2005. I had an AP portfolio due in 3 weeks. I had 12 pieces to go. If that doesn't sound like a lot, it is so much. So I listened to the audiobooks, and I could only listen to them while my hand was moving, which really, really helped me graduate. But let me tell you, this was 18 years ago, and I still remember the specific hyperventilation of getting to the last sentence of Lyriel and realizing that it was the end of the book, and I didn't have Abhorsen at home. Horrible. I thought I was going to die. I remember that feeling still.
I thought I was going to die, mainly because everyone had to wait for a year after it was first published, and they were going to kill me. Luckily, that didn't happen. So.
Yes, thanks to all of us, you're alive and here today. Whatever book brought you to Garth Nix's work, you know that it's magical, terrifying, fantastic, and immersive, and you know you want to hear about it. So please join me in welcoming tonight's author, Garth Nix.
Thank you very much. I would actually like to start by getting out my phone. I'm not calling home, I promise. I'd like to take a selfie with everyone, which I've been doing at all of my events. If you don't want to be in the selfie, just tuck your head under your arm like a swan or something like that. So I'm just going to try and work out how to do this from the corner. This can look a bit embarrassing, I mean for me. So, I've got quite a long arm. I've also got a very big head. I need to run up the other end and do something. Here we go. I'll try the other side. This looks very strange on social media.
because it has my head on both sides.
Make a panoramic out of it.
Yeah. I actually have such a big head that I once went into a hatter's and he measured my head that he started laughing. I thought that was a bit cruel, personally. My father has a big head, had a big head. Sadly, he passed away last year. And my mother has a small head, but she has a bump on the back, which is colloquially known as the Barlow bump, because her whole family has it. Of course, I have my father's big head and the bump on the back, so maybe that's why the hatter was laughing. That's by the by. Probably gone off track here already.
I think we're doing great.
Okay, all right.
So, welcome to the bookstore. When is the last time you were in the US?
2019, so it's been a long time. For obvious reasons, I've not been travelling like everybody else. It's wonderful to be back and seeing readers and being in bookshops. I've really missed being in bookshops. One of the things I always love about being on tour is visiting bookshops and seeing booksellers, and you can probably guess from the kinds of books that I'm writing, particularly at the moment. So it is wonderful to be back and seeing readers in person. So I really appreciate you all coming out. So thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, here's a clap.
Did you want to start with a little reading?
Sure, I haven't actually read it all on this. This would be the first public reading by me from the Sinister Booksellers of Bath.
Woo! We're special, you guys.
Oh, it's a bit true. I can't do. No, I can't. But I haven't chosen what to do. Yeah, interestingly. All right, I'll read from chapter 1. There is a prologue as well. Nearly all my books have prologues. Quite often you get writing advice that you shouldn't have prologues. You must not have a prologue. This, like most writing advice, is complete nonsense. Because of course you can have whatever you can get away with. And writing advice should always be taken with a pinch of salt. It may be right for you, it might not be. There is no one way to write a book. There is no one way to write a novel. It doesn't have to have a prologue. It can also have one. Anyway, there is a prologue. But I'm going to read from chapter 1. Chapter 1, Bath, Saturday, 10th December 1983. And then each of the chapters has an epigraph, and they all come from Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, from a 1907 edition of that book, which is one of my absolute favourite reference books. One of my absolute favourite reference books, which you can find online. The 1898 Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable is online at bartleby.com. But it's much better to get a physical edition and just browse through it because it's full of such strange and interesting things. But you need an old Brewer's. Anyway, chapter 1's epigraph from Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable is bees. With the Romans, a flight of bees was considered a bad omen. The small bookshop in Bath was not, in fact, small. It appeared to be no more than a cramped and narrow shop occupying half the ground floor of a 3-storey Georgian terrace house, the other half given over to an equally cramped tobacconist who sold dubious pipe mixtures of her own devising and cigarettes from east of Istanbul. But the small bookshop was actually an outpost of the Saint-Jacques clan, so there was more to it than could be seen from outside, both above and below. Even the tobacconist half was a front, inhabited by a right-handed bookseller whose awful offerings were a ploy to limit customers and allow her to get on with her researches into the works of Isaac Walton and obscure enchantments involving fish. The other 15 booksellers on the permanent staff of the small bookshop included a dozen of the left-handed variety, field agents, enforcers, and occasional executioners. Okay, got you where I want you now. Occasional executioners. They were primarily there to keep an eye on human interactions with the entity the Romans called Sulis Minerva. She inhabited the ever-popular Roman baths, and when given the correct gifts, properly inscribed, would grant boons of power, particularly to people seeking revenge or retribution. The baths were visited by tens of thousands of people every year, so it was hard work for the booksellers who monitored the queue going in, keeping watch for death cultists and others of that ilk, who came to ask Sulis Minerva for the causation of a fatal accident or an astonishingly swift mortal illness. A less careful watch was maintained outside the Bath's opening hours, the constant surveillance replaced by occasional random patrols through the evening and night. The bookshop was often used as a temporary repository for bulk purchases of second-hand books made in the West Country, an auction of the library of a distinguished lady, or sale of the property of a gentleman, being mostly books and the like. The books were sorted and catalogued there before being dispatched to the New Bookshop in London, the Muse Bookshop in York, or if they were too arcane to be sold, sent to the Crawley Tunnel Library in Edinburgh, the Salinay Mine in Cheshire, or to other secretive Saint-Jacques establishments. That's a little taste of the Sinister Booksellers of Bath. The prologue, of course, is all terrifying action before we get to
Real scary.
little restful stuff as we ease into it.
So I, for one, was really excited when I saw this because, as I've said, I started off as an Old Kingdom person, but I love Left-Handed Booksellers. It is one of my favorite books that you've written, and I was so happy we were going back here. Why did you come back, and what's it been like?
I always write the books that are sort of strongest in my mind, and the Sinister Booksellers of Bath was not in fact what I was going to do next, but it became strongest in my mind. And I actually don't know why, but I started sort of making some notes for it, thinking, oh, well, I'll do this after the next book, and then I made a few more notes and I started writing little bits of it. And before I knew it, I was writing the Sinister Booksellers of Bath, and not the other book that I was working on. Which is characteristic for me, I guess, in that there's been quite a few times where a book has leapfrogged over other things in progress. Sometimes it's gone completely past books I've already been contracted to do, and it's become a terrible shock to the publisher concerned. The basic principle being that as long as they like it, you'll get away with it. So it is a gamble, but so far, so good. I'm not quite sure why I came back to it, but I felt the need to tell another story with those characters, and I wanted to expand it to Bath as well. It's one of my favourite cities, even though I managed to get a little bit of Bath into the first book as well, because it's where Susan comes from, near Bath. And in fact, she comes from a house that we rented as an Airbnb about 5 years ago. I haven't told the owner that I used it as the model. Maybe I should. Or maybe I shouldn't, I don't know.
So this is one book where I didn't have the wherewithal to know that it would have another book. And you do write standalones, and then you also write a lot of books where there's an obvious series. Do you always know something's going to become a series when you start?
No, I actually thought the Left-Handed Booksellers, I wrote it as a standalone. I didn't intend to, but I also wrote Sabriel as a standalone. So there you go. And I wrote Liriel and a Porson as one book, one really enormous book, which I then, my editor at the time convinced me to divide into two and to actually expand both halves, so it became even bigger. But I think it became better for it. So that's a good example of when editorial input, which is always so annoying when it arrives. And she said, I really love this, but I think it could be even better if you expanded upon, particularly Liriel's earlier life, and you divided it into two books. Because when it was one book, it did not have, it had much less of Liriel's early life. So I told more of that, and that was Jenny So I owe her for that. Yeah.
Something that I like that it's at the beginning of both of the booksellers' books is your very careful disclaimer about historicity.
Yes, I should have read that, shouldn't I? Yeah.
Just that.
Yeah, just that, and left it. That's it. Yeah.
So yes, they say, if you're not familiar, that these aren't exactly the London or Bath 1983 that you would remember, and I quote, "What then is real?" So what made you let go of a strict adherence to history? Was it?
It's too hard.
Yeah.
No, I already changed it because I wanted this 1983 England to be a better version of England than it actually was. So it is more gender equal. It's a somewhat kinder place socially and so on, which I just thought was more interesting and is better. Why not? So once you've done that, then you've already twisted things a bit. But it is also to cover me from pedantic emails about how I put something on the wrong street. So I said, well, yeah, but in this England, it's not on that street. I don't care if you actually live there. I've got my out at the front of the book. Did you not read? Did you not read my general disclaimer? And just to give a little bit of freedom, I guess. Though at the same time, I've also tried very hard to make as much of the real things that I wanted to be in there real. So, I've not fiddled with it too much, because I think that's important too. To make fantasy feel real, it needs to have quite a lot of real stuff in it. You need a foundation of strong reality, whether it's drawn from history or real places, or even myth and legend, which is itself not real, but it resonates very strongly with us because we've grown up with fairy tales and fables and folklore and so on. So if you can actually connect back to those things, that makes your invented fantastical stuff also feel stronger and more substantial.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because my next question actually is about 3 of the things that you seem most excited about, that you make me excited about, that are just physical stuff that really add depth to the book, and that's clothes, cars, and books. So books, obviously this is a series about booksellers, and there have to be books. There are references to all kinds of people in here: Joan Aiken, Diana Wynne Jones, Frances Burney. I was so happy to see, because I wrote my dissertation on her, so thank you. You don't know who that is, but trust me, she ruled. So the books that come up in this story, are those things that have had a lot of influence on you? Are they just good reads? Do you hate some of them?
No, that is a good question. Nearly all the books which you sort of see on the shelves are books that are important to me, but also were significant in the early 1980s. So they had to sort of fulfill both those things. And actually this book, I in particular, I dedicated to Joan Aiken, Diana Wynne Jones. I'm just checking to see exactly who I ended up dedicating it to. Oh my gosh. No. Joan Aiken, Alan Garner, Susan Cooper, Diana Wynne Jones, and John Masefield. Because they were all people who excelled. They're all writing for children, and these are not for children specifically, though. They're crossover young adult / adult fantasy thrillers. They're for anyone who's old enough to read them. But those particular authors, I thought, one of the things they all did extraordinarily well was to blend the real world with the mythic underworld that coexisted, the magical world that coexisted with the contemporary world, and how those two mix and merge. The Dark is Rising, for example, or The Wisdom of Brisingamen, things, it's normal life and then it isn't. But normal life continues while this other fantastical stuff is going on. And that's what I wanted to do in these books, but in a sort of fantasy thriller version of that. So yes, they're all very important. Some of the books I might not particularly like are the ones you might see in the window of the old bookshop in Charing Cross.
Is Pet Sematary one of them?
Or
is that your favorite book of all time?
No, it is no. I actually am a Stephen King fan, but not a Pet Sematary in particular.
Yeah, I really like the way that pops up. Like, this is really located in time. This book has just come out.
Yeah, and it was a bestseller of that time. So I looked at the bestsellers of 1983. In fact, one of them I got slightly wrong, but of course it's not really that 83. Okay, it was 2 months early or whatever. Someone actually emailed me about that. And I, of course, said, read the disclaimer. So the books in the window of the old bookshop, which in fact sells new books, confusing, some of those are just the biggest books of 1983. I'm a bit concerned about this. just the big books of 1983. So they're not necessarily ones that I love. They just were big books. But almost anything else, when in the left-handed booksellers of London, when Susan is going through the new bookshop, which sells the old collectible books, and she sees a whole lot of her favourite children's books. They are, of course, also some of my favourite children's books, and very significant ones, which I still to this day try to collect. And I try and collect the exact editions I read from the library, which often means that I have 6 or 7 copies of one of my favourites because they're not quite right, but they look right when I see them on eBay or whatever. So yes, there's lots of little love letters to books all through these 2 books. Yeah.
Well, I think when I was reading this, I sensed some of those influences, some of those specific influences. Even though the book stands very well on its own and is doing entirely its own thing, you can see the brushing past of things like Susan Cooper and maybe the Dalemark Quartet. It felt was sort of in there.
Yeah, well, I think Tony Wynne-Jones is an influence, absolutely.
So I'm wondering if you have ever run across books where you feel confident that that author has built in the same way from your books.
Yes, but that is the natural order of things, and it's great. We're all part of this enormous literary family tree. I'm now a sort of old branch sticking out somewhere, and then there's all these other branches above and below me which have extended from that massive trunk of myth and legend and story which goes all the way back. And yeah, I mean, you could trace, there's so many influences that you could find in my books. I mean, if there was such a thing as a sort of literary pathologist or forensic literary pathologist who could do DNA tests on books, you would discover all kinds of writers that have influenced them, and not always the ones you would expect too. I mean, there's a lot of thriller writer influence in these books as well. So people like Desmond Bagley, Hamid Innes, Alistair MacLean, and also other influences from other media like The Professionals, and one of the reasons to make it a more gender equal 1983 was how horribly misogynistic The Professionals is. You know, I love the show, but you've just got to turn your head away sometimes, and things like and Minder. So there's so many different influences, and yeah, I'm glad when it's great to hear when people sometimes authors tell me, they say, I was inspired to write because of one of my books, and I find that wonderful because of course I was inspired to write because of all the writers that I love to read, and I started and I have continued writing the kind of books that I wanted to read, which are all the kind of books that they wrote. So it's just continuing that grand tradition. Yeah.
I said books, cars, and clothes. First of all, cars. I've never been excited about them before, but this book sort of changes that. Is this like a long-held interest that you finally get to exercise in?
Not really.
In this series, you just
just
really described those cars, though.
What is interesting is that I was much more interested in cars in 1983 than I am now. So I guess I'm harking back to that time. When I first went to England in 1983, which is one of the reasons it's set in 1983, because that's a time I remember very well. I bought a really beat up Austin 1100. It was a terrible car, even back then. It was already 15 years old in 1983, but it had a gold flame stripe up the bonnet. What do you call it? The hood. Up the hood, which made it go much faster. It was truly, the wheel literally fell off the car. I was driving along just outside Oxford. I saw a wheel roll past. I thought, gee, that's bad luck. Oh my God. And then my car crashed. I had 2 flat tyres in almost exactly the same spot in the Lake District, which I use as the basis for another quite long story I won't tell here. I couldn't even get the wheel off because the nuts had rusted on. It caught fire once in Cornwall, going up a hill. So all this smoke billowing out from underneath the hood. So I lifted the hood and I saw that it was oil that had collected underneath like a layer of oil under the hood that was burning. So I let it burn out, then I shut the hood and I kept driving. I was 19. But more importantly, in that Austin 1100, which I bought because I couldn't afford to buy a Jetson Interceptor or a Jaguar or one of the other much cooler cars and better cars, I reread many of my favourite children's books and other books in the places where they were set. So I read Dickens in London, I read Rosemary Sutcliffe on Hadrian's Wall, I read Alan Garner in Cheshire, I actually walked up Alderley Edge. I didn't find Fundendelve, I didn't meet Catalan. You may be surprised to hear that. So that was very formative, and that was when I decided that I actually wanted to be a writer. I had not thought that's what I wanted to do until that trip and rereading those books. And I started writing seriously then too. And in fact bought a Silver Reed typewriter from a W.H. Smith in Oxford. Sadly, and on that typewriter I wrote the first short story that I sold. Sadly, the typewriter did not stay with me because when I eventually got back to London, I sold the car. I had another little holiday in Europe. I came back absolutely broke, and I didn't even have the money to get to Heathrow to fly home. I had a return ticket, but I had absolutely no money. So I had to take my typewriter to a pawn shop, and I doubt that it's still there. Some almost 40 years later, that I could go and reclaim it. But I wish I hadn't sold it. I wish I'd kept that typewriter. So that was all very, very formative. Those books, those places, 1983, the cars that I couldn't buy, but wished I had, the cars that sped past me at great speed while my Austin was either losing a wheel or catching on fire. So yes, that's where the interest in cars comes from, even though I don't really have a current interest in them as such, or not really.
Well, the last thing I wanted to touch on was costuming, because I think, starting with Sabriel at least, I think you are willing to sit down and spend entire paragraphs describing people's clothes, and that is just fine, because their clothes are phenomenal. So I don't know if you've ever felt badly dressed because you're reading a book, but I've learned that it's possible. So how do you work out a character's style and make it fit their personality and their story?
That's a very good question, because I actually don't really know the answer, except that I do think, again, coming back to that, trying to create the reality of the fantasy, what people wear is such a big part of reality. So I always like to spend time on and think about how they would wear it and what they would wear. But a lot of it is sort of story instinct, which grows as I write the character, because I typically know very little about my characters to begin with, and I find out more about them as I write the story. And so it seems natural to me, for example, that Merlin would dress up as a character from Jane Austen. He just would. How I know that, I don't know. Merlin as Elizabeth Bennet just seems like, yeah, sure, of course, that's what he'd do. And he would know someone at the BBC he could get the clothes from. I guess it's quite organic. It grows as I think about the characters and what's going on. I mean, in Sabriel, for example, when she arrives at the Porson's house and she's skied, she's fought, she's been terrified, she would be filthy, and the desire to be clean and dressed, I think, is the natural thing that should come next. And it's just so much more interesting to actually write about what she's going to wear, because it's not what she came, even though she's tried to wear Old Kingdom clothes, she's wearing handmade clothes. But of course, part of it is she's being transformed by her clothes into what she really is, I suppose. So I guess in that, whoever said clothes maketh the man, and clothes maketh the person, or maketh the character. And I guess I also just like them. I mean, I wish, I'm not able to wear clothes very well myself, and I'm quite conservative. I don't like to stand out. I like to blend into the background. but I sometimes wish that I could be more flamboyant with clothes, because I'm interested in them. And also in the practicalities of them, in armour as well, for example, and clothes for protective clothing, for dealing with free magic, for example. How does that work? So I'm always sort of again, it's small details fascinating me.
Something that comes up in not just these books, but in a lot of your books, are characters who aren't human, so dealing with inhuman intelligences. And I think that you consistently are very good at making these characters feel distinct from humanity. So I was wondering, what goes into working out the nature of those intelligences? Is there a trick to it, a particular challenge, or does it just kind of come out naturally?
That's a hard question to answer. Again, people often ask me questions like this, and I feel a bit stupid because I can't explain how I do it. I mean, I think part of it is just story instinct, that they have to be different, they have to feel different. So how is that going to work? But I don't sit down and intellectually think about it. I just write it, and if it doesn't come out right the first time, then I'll just revise it until it does. So, I mean, what you're reading and when it works isn't necessarily something I just wrote. It's probably something that I revised 10 times maybe. Or I may have in fact written it, thrown it out, and written it completely anew in order to capture that voice. So, I mean, I really hate throwing out a big chunk of work. I mean, sometimes 10, 20,000 words. It's awful, it's painful, but sometimes it has to be done. The trick, of course, is that I also always doubt my work, usually about halfway through a book, and it's a temptation to throw it all out and start again. And I have to resist that temptation because it probably isn't. I just need to get over it and keep going. So I do force myself to keep going and then look back at it later and go, oh yeah, I'm glad I didn't throw that out. But then sometimes there are, generally they're discrete chunks, like a chapter that doesn't work. And then I think, okay, that chapter doesn't work, I've got to put that aside. And when I say throw out, I don't mean literally erase from the planet. I mean put aside, because it might come back again. I might use it again, or it might even come back into the book. It was just in the wrong place. So it's partly instinct, it's partly working at it till it's right. And I guess, yeah, it has to sound right to me. It has to sound right to me in order to sound right to the reader. If I can believe it, then I think the reader will. I want to believe in my stories and the characters. If it feels real to me, then I think, yeah, it probably will feel real to the reader, no matter how unreal it is. If you can just make it feel real, then yeah, it should work.
I remember reading maybe 15 years ago or something, you saying that you don't really do any advanced world building, and you sort of find the things you need as you get to those points in the story. Is that still true?
Yeah, basically. I mean, and again, there's so many different ways to write fantasy. Some people do immense world building before they even write any of the story, and that works incredibly well for them. I mean, it probably was the same conference. I thought I'd come up with something very original, and I said at this conference, a fantasy novel should be like an iceberg. The book is the 10% that's visible. The text of the book is the 10% that's visible, but you should feel the presence of that massive 90% under the surface of the book. And I thought that was immensely clever. And then shortly afterwards, I discovered that Hemingway said, all novels should be like an iceberg. It's like not even just fantasy novels, all novels. But then I sort of thought, oh, well, at least I was thinking like Hemingway briefly, in a good way. So yeah, I do think that, and I do think you have to have the impression that there's so much more there, and that if you need to know it, you will know it. That I will know it if I need to know it. And I sort of leave dangling threads for myself, which I will connect things up to later if I need to. And of course, writing a series, particularly a long series like The Old Kingdom, coming back to it, I do end up building more of the iceberg, or connecting to the threads, those those dangling, icy tendrils have to be knitted up.
Does that ever get you stuck in a corner where you left a tendril and now the tendril is bad?
Well, it sometimes makes it very difficult, but I don't think of it as being stuck in a corner. I think of it as that is the world. That it's like writing in the real world, where if you're writing an absolutely realistic contemporary novel and you're confronted with something that doesn't fit your story in the real world, you can't change the real world because you're doing a real story. So you're going to just have to work it out. So similarly, I think, well, this is the world. I've made it this way, so therefore I've got to work it out. So maybe I've got to tell it a different story. I've got to tell it a different way. Typically, it's helpful actually, because it means I need to think of a cleverer way to get to what I want to get to. So I do think once you start trying to retrofit stuff and change things, it just devalues the whole reality that you've spent so much time and effort establishing. So I prefer not to do that. Yeah.
I have a couple more questions before we let all of these folks ask some. I want to pull one line from this book, which I particularly liked. The malign old ones do not create. I thought that was so interesting, and it just goes by very quickly. And I would love to hear you talk about why that is and what else it might imply.
Yeah, that's kind of a thread that's through quite a lot of my fiction, I guess. It's in Grim Tuesday and Keys to the Kingdom. Now, Grim Tuesday can't make anything new, he can only copy, which is why he's quite keen on humans making things that he can copy. And in this, I think the malign old ones, also can't. I think that is pretty much a direct homage to Tolkien. Now you've asked me the question, which goes back to that Morgoth couldn't make anything new, so the orcs are copies of the bad copies of the elves and so on. Tolkien had a very big impact upon me, and is a very big influence, even though it might not immediately be apparent, because I'm usually not writing that kind of high fantasy with orcs and all that sort of Tolkien clone stuff, I guess. But I think he was a very big influence in ways like that, sort of thematically. Also, the whole idea of people having to do something that's extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, and they do manage to do so, but there's an immense cost. So you save the world, but it's not for you, as Frodo does in The Lord of the Rings. I think that's kind of through a lot of my books as well, and that's all from Tolkien. And I joke about this, but maybe it's because when my mother was pregnant with me, she was reading The Lord of the Rings, so I kind of absorbed it in utero. So I was always going to be a fantasy writer. I mean, as well as my name, which so many other authors are still suspicious of to this day. That's not your real name. You must have made that up. That's a pseudonym for sure. But actually, it is my real name. And maybe it's the power of names. I was always going to be a fantasy writer because of my name, as well as the in utero absorption of Tolkien. I'm not sure that's scientific, by the way.
The last question I want to ask is, this book is so full of Susan. It is every aspect of it is just about her, really, and other people are along for the ride, but we get so much of her, and it's wonderful. But her big concern in this book is, in the aftermath of what she finds out in the first book, retaining as much of a normal life as possible. In a book that's largely about magic and superpowers and old sort of gods, what's the argument in favor of being normal?
Well, I would say the argument isn't actually being normal, it's being human. And I think there's quite a difference there. And one of the things about the booksellers, they have their powers, they have their unique abilities and so on. They also do not really have the same morality as people necessarily. So they are quite ready to sacrifice normal people for the sake of maintaining order between the old world and the new. But they're also, like all long-term organisations, also quite ready to sacrifice people for the purposes of their own organisation. to maintain their secrecy and so on, which I think is a natural trend for any kind of powerful organisation that wants to keep doing what it's doing and not to be held too much to account. So I think Susan has seen that as well. And also, her father, the mythic creatures that she interacts with, they aren't human. And I personally think that if you encountered something which is really a sort of ancient demigod or an ancient power that has coexisted with humanity for a long time but is not human, the idea that you might become more and more like that would actually be rather terrifying. I'd want to hold on to my mortality and my humanity, to be able to love, for example, I think is something that is very likely to be lost along the way. So I think it's not about being normal per se, it's just about being able to be human.
It's good. Who's read it already?
Wow.
Okay. Well, the rest of you
Came
are
out Tuesday.
going to have such a nice time. And now I would love to turn it over to you guys. Questions?
How is Snufkin?
How is Snufkin? Well, Snufkin is his usual problematical self as I'm away. This is our dog at home. He got very used to everyone being home all the time during the pandemic. And since we've not been home all the time, we've had to have all kinds of special trips back home. Luckily, my office is 10 minutes away. So quite often I have to, there's going to be a thunderstorm. And he cannot be left in a thunderstorm. I've got to zoom home. So Snufkin is a rescue dog that we've had for several years now, who we thought was a Kelpie, but actually it turns out, and people kept saying, what kind of dog is he? And we'd go, oh, he's a Kelpie cross. And some people raised doubt about it. Other people about Kelpies were like, I don't know. And so we had a DNA test done that turns out that he is a German Shepherd, Australian cattle dog, American Staffy, Rottweiler, Samoyed, Whippet, something else which I've forgotten combination. We got the thing and it had pictures of all these great grandmothers. We're like, whoa, Samoyed. He's got little white patches behind his paws. So he's on my phone actually. I'll show you. It's on a lock picture on my phone. Yeah. Snuffy for sure. So yes, missing me, no doubt. I miss him. Good question. Thank you.
Yes, so I've seen a lot of your previous answers to the struggles with creating some sort of cinematic version of your stories, and that sometimes you want to be able to have it a certain way, and then even when you do perhaps start to head down, you've had technical difficulties or things falling apart last second. But as it continues to not happen, do you find yourself being more tempted to compromise over time? Is that temptation to give away some of your creative control approaching?
It's a good question. I'll just repeat that. Basically, in terms of screen adaptations of my books, of which there's been quite a number of iterations which have not been made for all kinds of reasons. As time has gone on, have I been more likely to compromise? I guess the answer is kind of yes, but only for certain projects. So some things I'm much more ready just to let them be optioned by a studio or whoever and not be involved. But there are other things where I do still want to be involved, and which makes it much more difficult. It's just the nature of the beast. But you just never know. It's just getting the right combination of people, really. It's always about people. I mean, it's about money as well. But both money for me and also money to make it properly, because there's no point trying to do it on a thread or any kind of these fantasy thing on a threadbare budget. But I still hope that the right combinations will come along. Frog Kiss is still in development with Disney as a musical. I was in LA last week and had some meetings about that. I'm not really involved. That's one where I chose to take the money, basically. But I also had confidence in the people involved, so it wasn't just as simple as that. And then there's other things going on. Keys to the Kingdom, we may be close to something. I'm not sure. Well, but we actually have a deal. There's just some other issues that need to be resolved. That's one where I would be involved. I'd be writing the pilot at least, or co-writing the pilot. The Old Kingdom, I co-wrote it. We did. It's been set up at different times as a film and then as a series with Amazon 4 years ago, where I co-wrote the pilot. They chose not to proceed after that. They spent all that money on Rings of Power. But the elves will die without Mithril. Excuse me? Yeah, well, I mean, it's all different people. I mean, we talk about these behemoth companies, but it's really about the people inside them. And if you get the right combination of people, then you can make really great things. So yeah, I'm still hopeful. I haven't weakened yet on the Old Kingdom, for example. It's probably true. Certainly for some things, I'm much more likely to be less strong-willed, perhaps. So we'll see. And the books exist. The books are here, and I'm going to keep writing them. And everything else is, I wouldn't say it's icing on the cake, because I actually don't like icing. I like cakes. There's a lemon drizzle cake, very important in this book. I had a launch party for the book last week, and I had 10 lemon drizzle cakes made by its fantastic baker near us, which were drenched in cedratine, like the cake in the book. Do you know how difficult it is to find this strange lemon liqueur called cedratine? Extremely difficult, let me tell you. I had to import it from the UK in the end, and to pay more in duties than it actually cost, I think. But it was a fantastic cake. Anyway, that's by the by. Lemon drizzle cake for the win.
What's the favorite book you've ever written? Like, what meant the most to you to write?
What's the favourite book I've ever written? My favourite book is always the one I haven't written yet. I mean, it sounds kind of stupid, but when I'm proud of all my books. I'm proud of what they are, but when I'm first thinking of them, they are really, really, really amazing. So in my head, they're just like the best thing absolutely ever. And then I start writing them, and they're still good. And then halfway through, they're crap. And then I sort of recover and I keep going. And then by the end, I think it's good, but I can't tell. And usually at that stage, I'm already thinking about another book, which is going to be really, really amazing. So it's always the next thing. And I always hope that I will get closer to it. I get as close as I can, but it's, I never actually get there. Occasionally I meet other authors who just think they have written the best thing ever, and they're a bit despondent because they've done it. There's nothing else left to do. And I think, wow, that's bad. I mean, I would not want that. It's better to be always hoping to do better, I think.
Yeah. I was just like, as far as like writing styles go and writing methods, like some people like to write, some people like to type, some people do post-its and whiteboarding. Like, what's your technique on the feel of your story? Just sit down and word vomit, or do you?
Word vomit. I tear pages from the dictionary. It's very impressionistic. I mean, I've done different things at different times. I mean, basically, all my earlier books I wrote when I had very busy day jobs. So my first 12 books or so, this is my 45th book I worked out, by the way. Though to get that number, I had to count some pretty small little books. It's like Very Clever Baby's First Reader, which is 8 pages. But it's still a book. So probably the first dozen or so, I had very busy day jobs, and I used to just write a couple of nights a week, normally Tuesday and Thursday. I don't know why. For appreciating certain Scandinavian gods probably, and on Sunday afternoons. And if you do that religiously in a year, you can have a book. And back then, I also used to write longhand first. So I'd write longhand, I'd write a whole chapter longhand, and then I would type the chapter, then I would print the chapter out, and I would revise it on paper, and then I would revise the electronic file as well, often many times. So I have complete handwritten manuscripts in black and red notebooks of Sabriel Durrell Pawson, Shay's Children, some of the Seventh Tower, Mr. Monday. There's a whole bunch of those. There's a giant stack of notebooks. But I also always used to just type straight out for short fiction, and I started doing that for the books later, though I still revert to longhand sometimes. So if I'm having difficulty or I'm travelling like I am at the moment, though to be honest I've not written anything at all this tour, but I might do. Theoretically, I might on a plane, for example, write longhand in one of my black and red notebooks, which I've got a lot, and one horrible blue and white stripy one because of the stationary drought. So that was my technique for a long time. Then when I could become a full-time writer, the first year I was a full-time writer was a disaster because I'd been super busy and wrote at night and did all of it. And then when I became a full-time writer for the first time, I was like, yeah, I'm a full-time writer, I'll do it tomorrow. And then 6 months into that first year, I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't written anything. So I had to find a new routine. And I actually went back to work for a literary agency as an agent at part-time, which gave me structure again. And then eventually I couldn't keep doing both, so I had to go become a full-time writer again, but I planned it more carefully. So the last 20 years or so, I treat it like a day job. I have a separate office, which I walk to, and normally I stuff around in the morning. I do correspondence and small business stuff, and then at some point I'll start writing. And usually that is straight on the computer. And what I do most of the time is revise what I wrote the day before, and then I continue on with the new work. So chapter 1 of my book has always been revised like 30 times. Chapter 2, 29 times. Chapter 3, 28. Except that I also revise the whole thing as well. But yeah, I go back, read what I've written, start again, start anew. That's basically it, with some variations. But there's so many people have so many different routines. I read in a biography of P.G. Wodehouse, who I love, is so funny, that he used to write really, really long outlines, like 30,000 word outlines for a 60,000 word novel. So chapter outlines of what's going to happen in each chapter, and then he would write the chapters, 1 to 30 or whatever, and then he would choose the chapter which he thought was most difficult to write, and he would start there. It's like chapter 28, that is the most difficult one. I don't know how he worked it out. And then he would do, chapter 28, then, chapter 7 is the second most difficult, so I'm going to write that next. And that worked for him. So anything is possible.
So when writing, has there ever been a character that surprised you? Like you in your head thought, oh, this is just going to be like a little side character, but then as you started writing, you realized that they were becoming more and more important in the series?
Sure. Has there ever been a character that surprised me because I've thought of them as a side character and they've become much more significant? Yeah, all the time, because I actually typically don't know very much about my characters when I start. So I'm constantly surprised, I guess, as I discover what I need them to do in the story. Some of them grow far beyond what I thought they might be early on. But because I actually don't really know what they're going to be early on, I guess it's not so much a surprise as partially an expectation. But even then, sometimes over the course of the book, a character will just impinge more and more in the writing and become more significant and become. I might think at chapter 5, well, they're fairly important, and then at chapter 20, I realise that actually they're very important. So that certainly happens. Yeah.
We have time for about 2 more.
You have a 1-week vacation in the Old Kingdom. Where are you spending your time?
somewhere really safe. Well, I mean, it would depend on the time, of course. It would depend upon the time. I would love to visit the Aborson's house, and as long as I didn't go into the depths below, I should be reasonably okay. And then I would love Anna Borson to fly me by paper wing to Bellassere, and then to the Clares Glacier as well. So a week isn't enough. I mean, it's actually like any other holiday. There's too many places to visit. And I would also like to visit the wall. I'd like to see that as well, but heavily escorted and made safe, I think.
First, a compliment as far as your world building. Like, I fell into your world with Shade's Children, and I remember the coolness of the metal and the feel of the bells and like the emotion from the booksellers. You do an incredible job.
Thank you.
My next thing is that I remember reading Shade's Children very young, and then finding Sabriel very young. And I had thought you had a pseudonym, and I was floored that you identified as he, him, but you wrote, I identify as she, hers, and that you wrote women and so clearly and beautifully. It was so non-gender specific sometimes. I loved it. And like, how do you approach that when you're writing these characters? Because I think you do it with such respect. I love it.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate that. I find it an interesting question, and I've been asked this question before, because people quite often ask me how I write women, but they never ask me how I write completely made up monsters. Because I share my life with immensely capable, powerful, intelligent women. I always have. To me, it's simply observation. To put them in stories, it's very straightforward. Much easier than a Mordecai, for example. But I think that's all it is. I mean, I think it is. I mean, I was probably very fortunate in how I grew up and where I grew up, in the company of women, and I have friends to this day. Women friends that one of my oldest friends was in Bacco I met at my 3rd birthday party, and she's a screenwriter that I co-wrote the Old Kingdom pilot with, and I've written other things with her as well, and we've been friends our whole lives. So it's people like that who I think have influenced it. My mother, I think, was a very, very strong influence, who's a paper maker and an artist. All the paper making stuff is all through all my books. The paper wing, that's straight from my mother's studio and a childhood of paper mache, which I actually also mentioned in the forward to. I actually have another book coming out this year. I should mention. Sir Herod and Mr. Fitz. They're sort of the stories of the Witch Knight and the Puppet Sorcerer, which is the complete collection of my Sir Herod and Mr. Fitz stories. And Mr. Fitz is a puppet who is a sorcerer, who entirely owes his life to me making puppets with my mother as a child, and that paper mache on balloons, layer after layer of glue and paper on a balloon to make the head of a puppet. And who knows, who knew that one day that would lead to all kinds of stories. So yes, I do think it's just observation, really. But I'm glad you think I do it okay. Thank you.
Sure, one more and then we're done.
I like to tell people about your books. It's like you're in a car with someone, and it's pleasant. You're in first gear, and then the driver smirks at you, kicks the gear into fourth, not slip, jams it over, and then you're redlining. You're redlining the whole way, and I feel like I've noticed as this has gone, you're sliding into that parking spot later and later. Left-handed booksellers, I was reading that and I was like, there's 2 pages left. So we're going 9 RPM. Are you trying to get in there later and later?
Not intentionally. I mean, it's just how. I mean, I think these are thrillers. So these, my sort of model is as much a thriller as a fantasy story. So I guess very much influenced by Desmond Bagley, Hammond Innes, Alistair MacLean, those guys, amongst others. So yeah, again, it's instinct, and hopefully it works.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.